The broadcast is now.
Thank you, Jill, and thanks everybody for attending. As Jill mentioned, today we're going to talk about data security and compliance plans. So really, the idea is creating a discipline so that we can consistently manage the sort of the waves, if you will, of data security and compliance, especially for people who are not experts at these things, people who probably have other business expertises. So make sure as we go through, if there are any questions, that you can put them in the chat or save them till the end. We're going to take some questions, and I hope this is informative for you. As always, if there's any follow-up questions, maybe you don't want to put it on air or anything like that, you can see my contact information here, or you could also ping me on LinkedIn or something like that, and we can continue the conversation. So anyway, let's get started. So just to do a brief introduction, sort of why we're here. Data is what gives purpose to our technology. So a lot of people think about how the sexy new iPhone they got, or they think about how they've upgraded their internet connection or their new devices or whatever, or their fancy software. But the reality is that none of this matters without the data that goes into it. Otherwise, it's just a tool. So it's an asset, but it's also a liability to us. So the data is what gives purpose to the technology. But if the data is lost or breached or something like that, it could actually cost us money. And so it's super important that that we take care of it just for the sake of our business. Not only that, but we have an ethical, moral, and often legal obligation to protect data. I mean, I'm sure anybody on the call has probably heard some sort of notification that their information was lost in a data breach. Perhaps you were a victim of the Target breach or with credit cards or something like that. I mean, pretty much the chances are, if you're somebody who has an electronic presence, that you've had your data breached in some way or another by a third party. Well, that really is upsetting, and we should do what's right by our customers and the people that we're data custodians for to protect their data. Most business leaders, as I mentioned, are sort of experts in their field. So and you want to get something out of the data, but security and compliance management is a huge challenge. If I go to you and I talk about why you need endpoint detection and response and MFA and encryption to meet this compliance requirement. I mean, you might understand the goal of the compliance requirement, but the technology itself is very difficult. Not only that, I mean, a lot of the policies and management things that you need to do to protect data are new to a lot of people. If you're a medical doctor, you know a lot about practicing medicine, you understand the principle of protecting technology, but you don't know what makes a good plan. So compliance standards are becoming more complicated and numerous as technology becomes more critical to our day-to-day lives. So just to give you, just in the short term, since right after the Colonial Pipeline breach, you saw a lot of executive orders come out of the administration talking about how not only are already defense contractors having to get involved with compliance standards with the DoD, but also other infrastructure-facing businesses that do work with other departments of the government. I mean, imagine if, for example, you work with the Department of Education. I could imagine more compliance standards coming down the line for those businesses as well. And the truth is that if you're holding any kind of sensitive data, something that is of value to someone else, someone's going to be watching it, and eventually you're going to have to comply to something. So today we're just going to talk about a few things, just a review of the threat landscape. What are the threats to data? I'm not going to belabor it too much. We talk about these things all the time, but we're going to pivot more to common compliance standards that a typical SMB will encounter. These are the things I see every day, honestly. Technical tools and practices that are necessary to adhere to many of the compliance and security standards. And we want to keep this high level. These are the things to look out for. Specifics that your organization are going to need is going to vary, and what products are right for you will really be a little bit of an independent thing. But you're definitely going to need classes of products and tools to get these things done. Similarly, we're going to talk about policies and non-technical controls that your management team will need. The reality is that when we expect the technology to do all the work for us to manage our compliance and data privacy, we're destined to fail, because the people are a huge element to this. People have to work in the right way. They have to follow the same processes, and they have to watch out for the human threats that are out there. We'll talk briefly about how you adapt to changes in the landscape so you can be comfortable managing compliance moving forward. For many of you, this might be a new subject. You haven't had to deal with managing data compliance or privacy ever. And so now you're stuck with this big thing. And let's say you sort of climb this compliance mountain, get to the top, and you're feeling good about it. Well, how do we stay sort of at the top of the mountain and not have to redo this process over and over again? How can we adapt to a landscape that's constantly shifting, where the technology expectations are changing, and the rules that we have to adhere to are going to change as well? And of course, we're going to get into Q&A, so make sure you leave your questions. Threat landscape. So what are some of the common threats to privacy, integrity, and availability in 2021? And I use privacy, integrity, and availability because that's a HIPAA term. I kind of like it as a principle. No matter what kind of data you're dealing with, if you're focused on protecting the privacy of it, which is to say, making sure that only people who are supposed to see it, the integrity of the data, which is to say, having clean data that is accessible and usable and that's not destroyed, and of course availability, being able to see the data, having the uptime to get to it. If you're able to achieve those things, you're meeting HIPAA compliance. But I would say even broader than that, if you're able to achieve that, you're probably achieving a lot of other compliances no matter what the data is. You could apply this to credit card information, social security numbers, personally identifiable information. These are good principles to operate by. Anyway, some of the threats to privacy, I would say, are insider threats. People within your organization that are either going to intentionally or unintentionally breach your data, usually as a result of the other point, which is phishing. When people are tricked into volunteering information about the business or your clients or something like that, or maybe accidentally giving their password to someone that they think it happens to be an IT administrator when it's actually a bad guy. Things like account abuse. So people are using their rights and maybe sharing it with people that they shouldn't have access to those rights. Of course, ransomware is a huge problem where not only with ransomware are systems locked up, but potentially with a lot of these ransom letters that are coming from ransomware, they are threatening to release information to the wild. So not only are you worried about getting your operation up and running, but you're worried about the embarrassment and potential legal liability of some hacker somewhere giving your information out to the public web. And then, of course, third-party data breaches. So, no matter what's going on, your data or your client's data that you shared with someone doing legitimate business could be breached by a third party. And you don't really have any control over that, but you have to react to it as well. Some of the threats to integrity of data, obviously ransomware is the first thing that comes to mind. If your data is encrypted by ransomware, there is no integrity to it. The data is essentially gone. You can't really break encryption super easily unless you have an encryption key. Sometimes I know there are ways to break ransomware encryption, but honestly, if you get to the point where you're looking at that ransom letter, you need to start looking at restorations and response, because there's a good chance you're not going to be able to decrypt it using means outside of the original encryption key. Obviously, system failure can be an issue as well. If you're still hosting things locally, you have either a local server, or a NAS device, or some sort of data that you control, or even in the cloud that another party controls, and all of a sudden that system fails, the drives die, the data is no longer readable, maybe there's a fire or a flood, that data is gone. We have to have contingency plans to deal with that. And then another thing with integrity is just poor management, storage, and organization of data. People putting things in the wrong place. If you had a ransomware incident and you wanted to know the impact of that incident because one machine got locked up with ransomware, but you don't really know what information was on that machine in the first place, we have a huge integrity problem. So we need to make sure that everybody knows where data is supposed to be stored, how it's supposed to be stored, so on and so forth. And we're going to talk a little about that with policy. Availability. So obviously the system failure thing comes to mind. If your internet connection goes out, or your system fails, or you have no access to your machines, you can't do work. And you can't really say that I'm a compliant organization when your systems are failing all the time. Forget about the security threats from third parties. If you have a unreliable system, a lot of auditors would consider you out of compliance. Just because your system is quote unquote secure, that you're not getting a breach. If nobody can access your data because you have a crappy system, you're not compliant. Of course, ransomware falls into this as well. I mean, we've all dealt with system outages, so I don't think I need to belabor the point. Common compliance standards. So these are some of the things that we see out there. Obviously, HIPAA is a big one when it comes to personal health information. And you don't have to be a medical provider to need to be HIPAA compliant. You can be, obviously an insurance provider, a healthcare provider, but also maybe somebody who does contracting for a healthcare provider that may have access to third-party data, someone who has incidental contact. DP Solutions, we're not holding HIPAA data, but if we're going into an operation that is HIPAA compliant, then we're responsible to be compliant to that standard as well as we touch the data or have incidental contact with the data. Similarly, PCI, this has to do with the credit card industry. Now, PCI is a really interesting one because it has to do with either taking, storing, running credit cards, so on and so forth. And the standards you have to meet are going to rise based on the number of cards you take, how you process it, whether you store stuff. My general advice to most SMBs is to touch the cards as little as possible and use third-party processors because then you lower your compliance exposure. PCI can be very difficult to manage consistently, and there's a lot of risks just to holding on to credit cards in the first place. The other thing about PCI is that PCI isn't really a government thing, it's an industry thing. And so a lot of the tools that are needed to do assessments, a lot of the management of it, the auditors of it, all have to run through the card industry itself. It's sort of the industry self-governing its own security. So that could be a good or bad thing, but it does make things a little bit more complicated and sometimes challenging. GDPR, this is a EU thing. So this is personally identifiable information of European Union residents. Now, you could be pretty much any business that collects personal information on a group, and you may have GDPR compliance concerns. I'm looking at a lot of times, retailers, especially online retailers who may have an international presence. Maybe you're doing contracts with people overseas. Chances are, if you're pulling information, it doesn't really matter. The reason to bring up GDPR is that if you're pulling information from people that are not Americans, you're probably going to have to have some international compliance to deal with. Now, granted, the European Union may have a hard time coming after you in the conventional sense, like the U.S. government may, if you're not up to speed with, say, HIPAA. However, you don't want to jeopardize your business interests by not being compliant. I brought up CCPA. So California is it's sort of a similar idea to the EU. If you're carrying information from California, and there's other states, I believe Massachusetts, New York, you're going to see privacy laws come out of pretty much every state in the country. I know this is being talked about in Maryland and others. Some people find this redundant. To be honest, it doesn't really matter because if you're holding personal information, you could sort of see the fact is you're going to have to be compliant to something. So even if it is a little redundant, we have to basically have an idea that no matter where we're located geographically within the country or in the world, if we're carrying personal information, somebody's going to be caring about it. Another one we put here is CMMC. So this is a little bit new, and certainly in the Mid-Atlantic region where we're based out of. If you're doing work with the Department of Defense, this is a certification model to do work and take on what's called controlled unclassified information. So any sort of contracting work or data with the federal government. The standards are pretty reasonable in the sense that you're using a lot of the NIST standards, which are a general good standard to run by. But just like anything else, the more information you take from the federal government, the more serious your compliance standards are going to be. However, things are still ironing out when it comes to things like audits, actual certification groups, people who can sort of give you the rubber stamp that says you're CMMC certified, things like that. But the expectation is that if you're going to do work with the federal government, you're going to have to meet the standard and do it successfully. Otherwise, you're going to lose business. There's a lot of technical tools that can be used to keep you compliant, and rather than, it's too much of a subject to get into every last tool you might need, but there are definitely tools you will need no matter what standard you need to adhere to. So let's get into a few of them. So the first thing is data backups and disaster recovery solutions. So in order to protect all, privacy, integrity, and availability of your data, there has to be some kind of assurance that the data you're using in your primary systems, whether that be local information that you store on PCs in your office or a server or a NAS device or whatever, or information that's in the cloud. So maybe you're using Microsoft OneDrive or SharePoint, or maybe using Google's cloud solutions or whatever. There has to be some expectation that if that data was unavailable to you or compromised in some way, that you'd have a way to get it back. Um, uh, Sometimes when you're using these cloud providers, in their contracts, they will outline, or the certain tier that you purchase will outline what the backup and disaster recovery solutions are and how these things are audited by third parties. And this is one of the benefits of using the cloud. You can often basically offload some of those responsibilities to a provider that has to do some of those things. But no matter what, at the end of the day, even though that data is sitting in someone else's environment, it is still your responsibility as a data custodian to make sure that it's protected, or at least have a good agreement with the third party to make sure it's protected. Password management and multi-factor authentication. The big one is the multi-factor authentication, but the reality is that at the minimum, we have to have some kind of password standard so that people aren't using, the password 123 and other garbage passwords and things like that. In the past, one of the standards was to refresh. There is debate as to whether that's a good practice or not, but things like password complexity, people not sharing logins, etc., that has to be a requirement of your compliance stack. Even better would be to have multi-factor authentication. If you're in a situation where you have data that's behind some kind of gateway, whether that's a web login or a PC login or whatever, that's essentially your vault. You can think of this data just like you would think of money, because that's what it is. It costs you money if that data is lost or stolen or broken or anything like that. And so a username and password is really not enough. That multi-factor authentication layer is like having a big lock on the door that makes it extra hard for people to break in. And so any area, any gateway, if you will, that will get you access to particularly sensitive information needs to have multi-factor authentication on it. The specific solution will vary based on the organization, what you're doing, etc. But it's really important that you have it. If you need help identifying where multi-factor authentication can go on your systems or where it's potentially risky, this is the type of conversation that's great to have with us. So please feel free to reach out. Device and patch management for all devices that touch your sensitive data. And I capitalized all because we're now in an environment where we have bring your own device, where people use their home PCs, their smartphones, maybe they have a work device and a home device they use, whatever, and these boundaries are sort of blurring. At the end of the day, it's critical that things like critical security updates, patches, certain security standards, etc., are touching devices that touch your data. I know that there can be some sensitivity from staff when we say, hey, we got to start controlling things that happen on your personal device. But there has to be a give and take here. If you're going to use a personal device to work from home on someone's data, then the company has to have some right to enforce patches and updates on this device to make sure that if the company's data, if you leave the company or you're terminated or something like that, that the company has the ability to wipe sensitive data, to wipe the data that belongs to the company from your device. It's sort of an agreement that it has to occur. We can't just let people go lax on their personal devices just because it makes them uncomfortable. What should make management uncomfortable is that their data is on insecure devices. Happy to discuss this in more detail as it applies to you. Endpoint protection. So this is a general category. So traditionally, you've heard of antivirus or malware protection. We've been moving a lot of clients to a product called SentinelOne, which is endpoint detection and response, which is a little more sophisticated, a little bit more designed to stop things like ransomware. Again, I don't want to prescribe this for everybody. It may not be a perfect fit for all organizations, but the point is that we need to have something on devices to sort of stop the malware and ransomware threat. The first thing, by doing the patch management that I brought up in the previous point, we are going to lower our risk because we're kind of closing some of the holes in the system that oftentimes lead to ransomware when someone clicks on an email or gets brute forced or something like that. But endpoint protection can kind of help be that sort of safety net that if something does get in, some piece of malicious software gets in, that something can maybe potentially stop a ransomware attack from happening. Keep in mind, none of these solutions are perfect, and they can only address known threats, and nothing is 100%. But the idea of all of these things, from the data backups to the endpoint protection and everything in between, is that we're just cutting a little bit off our risk. And Just like with a home, for example, you can have fire detectors and smoke alarms and fire fire extinguishers everywhere, but it doesn't mean your house won't catch on fire. It just means your risk is reduced. Encryption is a really important point for compliance as well. So there are two types. One is in transit and at rest. So if we're storing sensitive information at rest on a device, that device needs encryption on the hard drive. The best example I can give is a laptop. If I'm storing a bunch of sensitive information on that laptop and then I go to the airport and I forget to take the laptop off of airport security screening, and somebody picks it up, someone can't be able to take that hard drive out and read the information on it. And so that's where encryption can come in as an example. This is often required, not often, almost always required when it comes to protecting sensitive data. There's also encryption in transit. So if I'm sending, for example, my credit card number to DoorDash to order a burrito or something like that, there has to be something between me and the destination that makes sure that that number is protected, so that as it goes over the public internet, like everything else that we do, that number is not readable by just somebody on the web. That's where encryption in transit comes in. You don't usually notice this stuff happening, but it happens, and it happens on the configuration end. So if you're not sure where encryption is on your system, it should definitely be in any place where data is transmitted that is sensitive. There are a lot of ways to do it. Some of it is automatic, and some of it has to be added and configured. Last thing is monitoring and alerting. This is also a pretty general category because depending on your compliance level, it's going to vary. But oftentimes they don't want you to just react to things. They don't want you to just find out all of a sudden that your server is completely failed. They want to have safety nets in place that when suspicious things happen, that there's maybe some kind of red flag, or if something does happen, that we're able to respond as quickly as possible. And that's where monitoring and alerting comes in. This could be as simple as things like system failures, which is generally pretty easy and simple to monitor, to things that are much more sophisticated, like potential suspicious events happening on a network that could be the signs of a hacker, which obviously, this kind of managed security operation is much more expensive, but oftentimes for compliance, you need it. The level of monitoring and alerting is going to vary, so feel free to contact us if you'd like to discuss that further. It would be very important to talk about policies and other non-technical controls. We're giving people access to data as part of their jobs, and they play a role in risk management and compliance. So the first thing we should talk about is an acceptable use policy. People need to know that when they have access to our data or our PCs or our cloud environment or whatever they're accessing that belongs to the company, that there are acceptable things to do and there are unacceptable things to do. I don't think we need to be overly strict with acceptable use. I know people sometimes want to shop on Amazon on their lunch break or whatever. I mean, that stuff's generally not a big problem, but people should know not to visit suspicious websites, or maybe sites that have more mature themes or whatever on work PCs. Some of the sites that can be more dangerous. They should know that they can't download whatever software they want on it. They should know that they can't do things that aren't in the spirit of work. There are a lot of great templates for all of this, and happy to share that if you would like. A sensitive data policy is important too. Now, I should point out with all of these policies that people call them different things, titles and nomenclature notwithstanding. I want to get to the spirit of these policies and the things that I know you're going to need to have. So a sensitive data policy basically defines for an organization what data is sensitive and how it is to be handled. So if people don't know what's sensitive, how can we expect them to act responsibly with it? If we don't define that these pieces of data matter to us, some of it for legal reasons, perhaps some of it for business reasons, something doesn't have to have a compliance reason to be sensitive to the organization. Perhaps it's a trade secret, what have you. We need a document that just shows and tells people what is sensitive to us. Again, that can vary for your organization. Incident response, disaster recovery, business continuity. There's going to be an expectation that you have some kind of plan in place that if bad things happen that are external factors, God forbid, we had the pandemic, but like fires, floods, major weather incidents, whatever, even just maybe even things like someone intrudes the building or something like that. We need to have some kind of policy that tells people how they need to respond and create business continuity during these kinds of incidents. If people don't know how to respond, then we're going to have a worse outcome and be out of compliance. Another thing that I think is really important is security awareness training. So everybody needs to give their people some basic knowledge about what's going on the web and what the threats are to them. People need to know what ransomware is, what phishing is. They need to understand how criminals on the web socially engineer them to try and use their personal information against them and break into their accounts and steal data. They need to understand the proper ways to respond to incidents, so on and so forth. We don't want to create security engineers. When I do security awareness training for our clients, the goal is to give them the ability to respond to things and make good judgment calls at the time. And if we can get better responses out of people, it does such a great thing both for our compliance management, but also for avoiding incidents. I really do think people can be both an asset and a liability to our security and compliance, and I want to make them an asset. How to navigate the future of compliance and risk. So I've talked about a ton of stuff, and it's only been 30 minutes, and it can feel pretty overwhelming. The rules are changing all the time. Maybe I use terms that you guys haven't even heard of before. So, things like multi-factor authentication. We hear about all these hacks, and then we have to do new things as a result of them, or we didn't think we were compliant to something, and now all of a sudden we are. How can we ride this wave as opposed to being knocked off of it? So, I mean, the number one thing, and I didn't even, and I'll get to it at the end, is, but stay informed about your industry and the threat landscape within it specifically. So, if I was an infrastructure business, Colonial Pipeline, for example, I would consider them sort of an infrastructure type company. They transport energy, if you will, but they transport oil across the country. Let's say I was another pipeline company, maybe in the Midwest or Southwest or whatever. You'll have to excuse me, I don't know a lot about the industry, but I would be on pins and needles, making sure that my security was up to snuff. If I was seeing a lot of different sort of security trends and threats within my industry, I would get right on top of that. And again, this is regardless of compliance standards. It's just knowing what's going on to others in your business. And I'm sure everybody on the call, if you are networking, you probably know, either friendly competitors or people from different regions that you network with. I know I do as an MSP. Conduct periodic risk security compliance assessments. In other words, we just can't leave this alone. Every year or so, we need to go back and say, well, what are we doing as an organization to manage this stuff? Are we meeting our goals? Are we achieving things? Are there holes in our plan? And the chances are there are. I mean, as a year goes on, a lot of changes happen. People come and go, the business changes, weird incidents happen, whatever. We have to reevaluate and make adjustments. But it's much better to make adjustments than it is to start from scratch, and that's where assessments come in. If we're doing these assessments consistently, we're generally going to have better outcomes and less work to do. Make compliance a part of the decision-making process during times of change. I'm actually having a blog coming out this week for the last week of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is about building security in as part of design, and it's a really great thing. It's the theme of the week for the Awareness Month. Because a lot of people get very focused on the goals of something as opposed to protecting it. So, hey, we're going to do a move and we're moving all our people and it's going to be great. Or we're going to get this new application. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to improve our efficiency 50%. Or everyone's going to get new iPhones. It's going to be terrific. And they focus on getting these things in, or they get their new phone in the mail and they start doing all this stuff on it. And then later they decide to put the endpoint protection on it, or later they decide to change the default credentials or something. Security and compliance has to be a part of implementation. We don't want to react to this stuff. We want to build security and compliance in. If you're making these serious changes and you're not thinking of security up front, you're kicking the can on it. You're making a huge mistake and putting your business at risk. The last thing, and this is the most important thing really, is just stay ahead of the curve. Don't wait for something to be mandated before you do it. Ask a lot of questions. Just because no one's knocked on your door yet about compliance doesn't mean you don't need a compliance and data management program. You want to be in a position that when someone does knock on the door, that you're already sort of running. Imagine if you wanted to, be a quarterback in the NFL, and all of a sudden you got a call to do a tryout, and you haven't been working out because no one's giving you a call. I mean, well, you're going to really do bad on your tryout. When someone's waiting for that call to take things on, they want to be prepared. They want to be in good shape and ready to take on that role. So think of your compliance plan kind of like that. Maybe that's an okay analogy. So anyway, just in conclusion, due diligence is the most important aspect for managing data security and compliance. We have to do this stuff up front. We have to stay on top of it and be proactive. We really want to implement a combination of technical and management controls to limit risk and prepare you to deal with a variety of compliance standards that could come down the line. It's really not that complicated. The biggest part is just caring about it and asking a lot of questions and continuously evaluating it. When you don't know the answers to these questions, I don't expect you to know how to encrypt a network, or how to encrypt data, or how to create a working backup or something. But what you should know is what the impacts are of data breaches and data losses and system failures to your business, which can help the technical people like me or my colleagues figure out what the solutions are that will address those concerns. Anyway, that's it. Happy to take some questions right now. While you're getting those questions in, first of all, we've got the webinar coming in November. We're doing it, about a week before Thanksgiving. We want to make sure. I know the day before Thanksgiving is probably a no-no for a lot of people. So the subject is, why do my accounts keep getting hacked, and how could I stop it? So we're just going to bring it back to fundamentals. So we see it all the time. People complaining that they've gotten an email that their credentials were changed on some personal account they have, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And I just want to talk a few reasons about why this stuff happens, how we can stop it, and how we can all be a little bit better at this stuff. It's not going away. It seems to happen constantly, but all we can do is sharpen our swords, so to speak, against it. As always with anything, feel free to send me an email if you got any questions, or reach out to me on LinkedIn. Jill, do we have any questions from the group?
Yes, we do. So we have a couple questions. One of them is a little lengthy, so I'm going to text it to you while I read it out loud as well.
Okay, I see it here.
So how can you control or verify data integrity when it's part of a large provider service, for example, Dynamics 365? For example, how can we test verify the process if the primary data location has issues and Microsoft Auto moves us to the backup regional data center location? Even more so, how can we verify the backup data centers have our current data and test the process for interim operation and recovery?
Sure. So the short answer is you can't, which is to say that if you're doing business with Microsoft and their public cloud, like a Dynamics 365 or what have you, they have a lot of responsibility and a lot that they owe you. And depending on the flavor or licensing model or whatever you have of whatever you're using in the public cloud, there are certain things that they're going to have to guarantee to you as part of it. The other thing, and Microsoft publishes a ton of stuff on this if you really are bored and you want to fall asleep, but you can go online to the various Microsoft products and see some of their statements both on compliance and also auditing. So, Microsoft, for example, they have just one example is the Government Continuity Cloud, I think is what it's called, GCC. And in order to get into GCC, you have to be a relevant vendor who does work with the government. And not only that, you pay a lot more money, and then Microsoft does all this special stuff for security and to meet government compliance. But the beauty is that Microsoft has to do all of these steps. They have to guarantee that they're bringing in auditors to look at these things. They have to go through all of the assessments, all of these data center tests and backup location data centers, et cetera, et cetera. They have to test that stuff in order to do business as well as be certified. The other thing is, and I sort of alluded to this with some of the compliance standards, is the further you go up the scale in terms of the amount of data that you hold, the more scrutiny and the higher the standard has to be. So what a Dynamics 365 or a government continuity cloud has to do to protect their data and meet a compliance standard is way, way, way bigger than what a SMB might have to do in a small data center that they manage out of a closet in their office. Now, if the SMB decides to hold dramatic amounts of data locally, then things tend to get a little messy because they tend to increase their data compliance needs while having the resources not to manage it, which is why a lot of these public clouds are such a useful service. I sort of hope that gets to the answer to the question. I mean, the fundamental thing is we have to do business with groups that we can have trust in, and what we can do as managers of and data custodians who are taking in this data and using these public clouds is make sure that we're using the right class of product, that they are addressing when we sign up for this product our specific compliance needs, that our data is in a place where it's supposed to be safe, and then make sure that the business stays on top of it. If the government ever comes after us, or whatever compliance standard ever comes after us and says, hey, you know, Microsoft got breached, but you're in the government continuity cloud and you're doing all these things, it's hard to get angry at you, the individual business that did everything that you were supposed to do and followed guarantees and auditors down a logical path. So it's a long question. It kind of has a long and complicated answer. I'm happy to talk about this some more offline.
Okay, great. Yes, feel free to reach out to Ben if you would like to talk more about that. Great. We do have another question that came in. How do you balance the installation of company software on personal devices, such as Intune, with potential liability or privacy concerns of employees? Worse, external contractors with access to your system, either service providers or directly employed contractors.
Yeah, very common question. So there's a few layers here. So I'm going to take it one piece at a time. So let's talk first about the privacy concerns of employees of, say, an Intune. So for those who are not aware, Intune is a mobile device management tool. You want to make sure somebody's phone, where they're getting company data on it, is reaching a level of security. You might use Intune to manage those things. First of all, Intune doesn't have, and all these other products don't have to have privacy concerns. These products are not made and don't have to be made, and it can be explicitly stated that we are not monitoring the websites you go to, your text messages, your personal emails, etc. What these products do is they enforce things like, for example, that you can't have your phone on without a lock screen. And you have to do that. You have to do that to access our data. You have to have a system that forces people to say that your apps must get updated, or that you can't jailbreak your phone to install unapproved applications, because now we're mixing the company's risks of getting a data breach and a liability that the company is going to have to pay for with the personal concerns of an employee who wants to break security rules. And the answer to the question fundamentally is, if the employee is not prepared to sacrifice a little bit of really just their security settings, not their privacy really, but their security settings in order to do this, then they can't use their personal device on our data, period. End of story. We can't put we can't put the concerns of an employee to sort of do irresponsible things on their device above the privacy needs of the company and our either our clients or the third parties that we hold data of. External contractors, it gets even more dicey, obviously, because for an external contractor, they have limited I mean, they have some responsibility to you, but obviously it's not the same as an employee. But it's sort of still the same deal. Like, if you're going to give somebody direct access to your system, then they have to follow some rules. If that doesn't work, then you need to find a way to share the data with them in a way where their devices are outside of your network. But then they have to agree to protect that data in a sensitive way. So I'll just create a brief scenario. So you've got a third party and they do billing for you. And so you send sensitive information to that third party. That third party has two ways to get to that sensitive information. One is you give them direct access to your system. In order to do that, we have to put a level of security on it. So we do all sorts of device settings, password management, login management, whatever, everything we need to do to make it secure. And they're sacrificing something to do that. They're sacrificing some individualism on their device, if you will. The other way to do this is to say, okay, we're going to somehow export this data to you. We're going to provide you some sort of secure transfer of this data so that you hold on to this data. But now guess what? Now you're a data custodian. And now since we're sharing this with you, we're expecting you to agree to all of these things. We're expecting you to have minimum level of security. We're expecting you to encrypt this data. We're expecting you to destroy the data when you're not using it anymore, so on and so forth. If they can't agree to that, then you can't share that data with them. At the end of the day, the business is at risk. And when third parties don't want to play by the rules, then we can't do business with those third parties. Otherwise, we're putting ourselves at risk. Obviously, this is a tentative thing, and we're talking about some conflict here, but it has to be done. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of liability. I'm not sure what liability, what liability we would actually have towards employees for a mobile device management thing. I just don't know. We're not going to damage their device or their data with this stuff. So I don't feel like it's a liability thing. I guess the one thing you could theoretically say is, what if Intune itself is corrupted and then that breaks all of my systems? I mean, I just don't think that it's sort of like medicine is worse than disease kind of thing, because I know, here's what I know: if we don't have any security management, we will get a security incident. The security management helps reduce the risk. We can't avoid it just because we don't want to take our medicine, so to speak. So that's kind of my take on it. Again, it's another sort of complicated question, so I hope I addressed it. You can always feel free to reach out to me offline, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of these points or get more specific.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions coming through.
All right, great.
Yep, I think that we can wrap up.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. I know I was a little wordy at the end there. When you have some complicated questions, the answers get a little complicated, especially when you don't want to be, I don't want to overprescribe a specific solution to somebody where I don't know the details. But please join us for the November webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today. Feel free to reach out if you need anything else, and stay safe out there. Take care, everyone.